What's up, everyone, and welcome back to SANDCAST, Beach Volleyball with Triborn and Travis Mewhirter. This is not a solo episode. This is a rare introduction. I was so fired up to have the guest that we have on, Rob Gray. He is sort of the father of the ecological dynamics movement, kind of the pioneer of modern coaching, so to speak. And when I got the job at Florida State, I went back. First thing I did, as I mentioned on a couple podcasts that we did with John Mayer and Billy Allen, was go back through all of their Coach Your Brains Out podcasts and pick out as many of the ones I could that had a lot of value or perceived value in it. Got a ton of value from that, but none more than Rob Gray. So Rob Gray, he wrote these 3 books right here: Learning to be an Ecological Coach, How We Learn to Move, that was the first one I read, and then Learning to Optimize Movement. And that sort of laid the foundation for my coaching philosophy, which is essentially, if I had to sum it up, would be competition with a purpose, where we're just competing. Everything is very representative. And I got all of that from Rob Gray. And so it was such a pleasure for me to have him on the podcast. We did it via Zoom. And the connection, whether it was my Wi-Fi, his Wi-Fi, whatever it may be, it wasn't great. So we had to turn the videos off. And so the video portion of this that you have on YouTube, if you're watching this, obviously you're seeing it, but the video is just going to be a blank screen. And so sorry for that. The audio is going to be unaffected. That was good enough anyway. There's a couple times where I cut out and Rob says, "Hey, you cut out. Can you say it again?" Just happens, technology. That's why we try to do as many in-person ones as we can. But this is an exception. I'm excited. I was really excited to have Rob on the show. I think there is a ton of value packed in here, even if it gets a little bit sort of jumbled up because of the Wi-Fi disconnect. But enjoy the episode. Thank you, Rob, for coming on. Thank you to John Mayer for hooking me up with his contact info. And man, tons of value in this one. So enjoy. Shoots. Again, thanks for taking the time to hop on. But yeah, just finished up my first year coaching at Florida State. It was my first sort of full-time foray into coaching, and I had come across your work through Billy Allen and John Mayer, and your books, How We Learn to Move, Learning to Optimize Movement, and now Learning to Be an Ecological Coach, have sort of formed the foundation of my coaching philosophy, if you will, and it's a rough draft being so new into it. So first I wanted to just say thanks for writing that, and it was super useful to me, and it was fun too. It provided such a fun framework when I was designing practices. But for our listeners who are a little bit uninformed about ecological dynamics, this is kind of a big question, but if you had to sort of sum up what being an ecological coach or an ecological practice would mean, could you just kind of run our listeners through that?
Yeah, it's kind of a shift from the traditional way of coaching, right? Is we take a skill like setting in volleyball and we pull it out of the game, or passing in volleyball. We take it out of the game, we break it down. We have you we try to give you kind of the optimal correct technique for how to do it, right? Hold your hands like this, bend your arms like this, and we get you to practice it over and over again, kind of strict repetition until you kind of develop, you can do it automatically. And then later on, we hope that you can put that into the game and decide when it's appropriate to use that skill. And that's kind of been the dominant model for a long time, this kind of motor memory, repetition kind of approach, and breaking and working on the fundamentals first. In the ecological approach, the idea is more to, instead of trying to give an athlete the solution, we let them find their own, really, and kind of really, the one way kind of phrase I like to use now is, instead of giving athletes solutions, so trying to teach them the proper solution for passing a volleyball, we try to give them problems. So we create practice conditions where they can learn to, we vary what we call constraints in practice: the number of players, the size of the court, the height of the net, the size of the ball, whatever. There's a whole bunch of different options to try to get them to learn these solutions and kind of make more of an adaptable athlete. That's I guess I'd say, the overall summary.
And it's such a kind of a forward-thinking approach to coaching because, like you said, I feel like for generations, the way that we viewed coaching was pretty top down of, hey, here's how to
Mhm.
do this. Let's repeat it until you sort of get the quote unquote muscle memory, and then you have the skill. And it's still that I feel like that's still the dominant way of coaching today. And I'm wondering, how did you get into ecological coaching? I know that because it's still, to me, I think it's still kind of you're kind of trailblazing a new path that not that many people are going down. I know at the beginning of learning to be an ecological coach, you mentioned kind of a core memory with your hockey coach.
Mhm.
But I'm wondering because it's a bold initiative to kind of flip the coaching industry and tradition on its head a little bit.
Yeah, I guess so. I'm a faculty member at ASU. I've been researching skill for a long, long time, for almost over 25 years now. So I've done a lot. And so initially, I kind of was studying the kind of traditional model, what we call the information processing model of skill. This idea that you're building up this kind of motor, this memory structure inside the athlete that allows them to perform the skill. And I did that research for a long time. And it was really when I started, and I did have some kind of things that disagreed with it. But it's really when I started about 10 years ago or so, I started working with sports teams and organizations trying to apply these ideas, trying to, here's this player struggling with this. What would you do to get him better? And I found it wasn't really working, right? That what I had been doing wasn't really helping me. I had to kind of think in a different way. At the same time, I was trying to find, like, I was trying to identify what are the key, biomechanical or whatever variables that skill elite performers have, right? If you look at my sport, I look at is baseball, main one. If you look at what does every great baseball player do? And you find there's not really that many of those, right? There's a whole bunch of different ways to swing, depending on where the pitch is, what type of pitch. And so, kind of looking at the idea that there's not just one way to do it. There's multiple ways to do it. Skilled athletes have kind of variable movements, and so it's kind of a gradual transition. I heard of these ideas a long time ago when I was in grad school, and just they've become more and more sense as I have got over and kind of applying them to sports. And a lot of kind of there's a lot of people that have been pushing this approach and bring up some key things along the way too. And I agree with you. I think it's still the dominant approach. Although I find a lot of good coaches I work with have been using these ideas for a long time. Right? They've been creating kind of challenging practices for their athletes, not telling them what to do so much. They just didn't call it, and they use the terms I use or have the
Right.
theory to frame it on. I think it does kind of it has some of the core ideas have been around for a while, just in different forms.
Right. Now we put a name on it. It's funny
Yeah.
because I'm thinking about my own athletic journey and my dad. So he coached me in basketball, and whenever I needed kind of a swing tweak when I was a golfer, my dad would kind of give these external cues, which I didn't know that they were external cues at the
Hmm.
time. And now that I've kind of gone through your books and done a little bit of research and reading up on the topic, and my dad he didn't really research any of this stuff. It was just
Hmm.
kind of an innate thing for him to do because he grew up in sports and played quarterback in college. And so a lot of his coaching, I look at now that I've sort of opened my eyes to the research around it. I'm like, man, you were kind of ecological in your own way. Because, for example, when he was running a basketball practice when I was in middle school, he put what's called a bubble on top of the hoop so we could work on rebounding. And so what the bubble did was even if you shot a perfect shot, you were going
Hmm.
to have to rebound because the hoop was blocked. And so instead of teaching us how to rebound, he put us in a scenario where there was going to be rebounding every time the shot went
Oh,
up,
that's
whether
awesome.
we made it
Mhm.
or didn't. And I think you brought it up in your book. I know that Daniel Coyle did in the Talent Code, but in Brazil, with all their soccer players, everybody thinks that it's all their clubs and academies, but it's a lot of the small-sided 6-on-6 games where the fields are bumpy, and sometimes it's 6-on-5, and they call it pelota because it's just pickup.
Mhm.
And these small, constrained environments teach you ball control with your feet, and they teach you different types of movement patterns. And now it's fun to see that there's actually some words to describe it and a framework for it.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like I said, a lot of coaches, I think, have kind of figured this out on their own, kind of by experimenting or intuition. And yeah, the golf the external cues, that's a good example of the golf. I find it frustrating whenever I go to like somewhere like Top Golf where you watch and you have someone that doesn't really play golf and everyone around them is yelling all these internal, bend your knees more, get it. There you can see their head exploding. It's so frustrating. Yeah. So it is, yeah, but I agree with you. I think like I said, a lot of the people have been um using these before. Yeah.
And can you run through the benefits of and sort of explain internal versus an external cue and why an external is the more beneficial way to coach or guide someone to a
Yeah,
solution?
so this goes back to a person, work of a person named Gabby Wolf at UNLV, and how she defined it is internal cue is one that gets you to focus on your body while you're moving, while you're executing your skill. So make sure you bend your elbow or what you do with your knee. The the um, sorry the external cue is really more focusing on what the effect your movement is having on the environment. So where the ball goes when it leaves your club, or the pressure you're getting from the ground. So it's kind of a subtle difference at times, but there's a very large amount of research showing that the there's benefits to the external, right? In terms of the ecological approach, we think it lets you kind of better self-organize instead of when you kind of think about what your elbow's doing, you're kind of really kind of restricting instead of just letting it kind of do on what we call self-organization.
And it's kind of for me, I find the internal versus external cue a fun creative challenge as a coach because my whole career prior to this was in journalism, it was in print media, broadcast, and I played professionally in beach volleyball for a handful of years. And now it's fun for me to try to explore different ways to describe ways to
Hmm.
for athletes without using, put your hand here or do this with your feet. Now it's a fun. I find it to be a very fun challenge, if not frustrating at times.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the way I kind of pitch it to coaches. I think, just trying to change an internal cue to an external cue is just, even it just gives you another way to instruct your athlete at the very least, right? So I think it's a useful endeavor. Mhm.
And when you were on Billy and John's podcast most recently, um, they asked you how you would describe fundamentals. And so in sport, there's a lot of different variable solutions to different problems. You see in golf, for example, you'll see a dozens and dozens of different types of swings.
Mhm.
But there are certain invariances with how you grip the club and the basic swing path. And there are certain kind of fundamentals, things that how a platform would look in volleyball or how a swing would look at contact in your current sport of baseball. But how do we develop those invariances that we see frequently in sports?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's the key term we use, invariance, things we don't want to change from swing to swing, execution to execution, shot to shot. Um, there's the kind of the new view is that there's lots of variance. There's lots of things that we want to allow to change, we need to allow to change. But the invariance, yeah, there's kind of couple of different ways. One of the main ways I try to do it is understanding kind of for example, to hit a golf ball, well, you need to transfer force from the ground to the club to the ball. So you need to make kind of have a good kinetic chain, which is kind of movement of force through your body from your feet up your legs to your core to your arms to your hands. So we need to make sure there's some kind of fundamental principles of how we keep that intact and things like that. So it's kind of an analyzing movement, understanding kind of what needs to be there. It's more it's more kind of principles like effective force transfer instead of positions. Like you need to have your elbow bent this much or your lead arm, you need to have a neutral grip at contact or whatever it is. Those are kind of specifying a very specific movement pattern. This ones are the what we're talking about in terms of variance are more properties of coordination that can be achieved in a lot of different ways.
And I think one of the more difficult, and you're obviously at the highest level of sports with the MLB. I think one of the more difficult propositions is youth coaching and
Mhm.
developing fundamentals with young kids. So for example, I have a toddler. He's 2, and all he wants to do is play with sports. And I get home, and he wants to do some spiking, and then he wants to play some baseball, and then he wants to play with tennis, and he loves doing everything one handed. And right
Mhm.
now, I'm just kind of letting him and seeing if he figures it out that maybe two hands would be better with certain things. But I'm curious if you have any tips, theories of how, let's say, a youth baseball coach, for example, could get a fielder to field a ground ball in a pretty fundamental, invariant way and to swing a bat.
How we can get them to do two hands.
Right. Or
Um,
just to develop, like where do we even start to develop these sort of skills?
Yeah, I think I think we start by making sure we keep the skill in the game, the context instead of breaking it out. So we want them to, catch a ball ideally with, having it hit at them, with very not completely predictable, where the ball is coming same number of hops, same direction, same speed every time. Want a little bit of variability in there, so they kind of have to make adjustments. That's one of the things that's going to drive that you kind of move towards having, whether it's two hands or getting in front of the ball. And then kind of having, ideally having someone have a little bit of time pressure, you got to beat the runner, things like that, instead of having a very repetitive pulled out of the game. So kind of, and then based on what they're specifically doing, we can think about constraints. We can add, a heavier ball, a flatter, smaller glove, right? That's gonna, when we use those still training high level players, something that has much smaller pocket. So there's a few different depending on what kind of issues we were dealing with.
I like the smaller glove. And you guys use that with the Cubs? Sorry,
I'm
did we cut?
losing you again.
Sorry, did we cut out? We
Okay.
back?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Sweet. Oh, no, I was saying that I like the smaller glove concept. Do you guys apply that with the Cubs?
What's that? Sorry.
The smaller glove that you were talking about with
Yes.
fielding?
Hmm.
I'm wondering with,
Sometimes, yeah, some teams use that. We've used that at kind of professional level. Yeah,
okay.
for field for teaching defense. Yeah.
And so your title's the director of sports science with the Cubs?
No, I'm just I'm not a full-time, so I'm a sports science. I'm just more of a consultant. I'm a
Got it.
part-timer. So and I kind of have dual two roles. I do some sports science things, and also I'm kind of a skill acquisition specialist. So I kind of give input on how we should be practicing the effectiveness of our current practice and things like that.
That's fun. And you've delved into a lot of different sports. I'm sure it's pretty fun for you to go from baseball and hockey and come on a volleyball podcast and apply the principles into a lot of different sports.
You're really breaking up again.
Man, sorry, Rob.
No problem. I don't know if it's a bad connection or.
Yeah, maybe. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
But yeah, I was just saying that I feel like for you, it's probably pretty fun to go from sport to sport to sport because you're working with the Cubs. You got a background in hockey. You come on John and Billy's podcast to talk about volleyball. I'm sure your research has taken you everywhere. Is it fun for you to apply your principles across the full spectrum of sports?
Yeah, for sure. That's one of my favorite things when someone from a new area contacts me. Some of I've been recently getting into training MMA athletes to police training. So kind of some very broader things. Yeah, I really like the challenge of applying it to a new area. You do need some uh, a level of expertise in these with your specific skill to do it effectively. But so I do find that kind of quite enjoyable.
And do you
And I think it's useful. I think it's useful for any coach to kind of see how people are doing in another sport. I think it would give you some ideas and to talk through it.
Yeah, and do you come across resistance when say you go to give ideas to the Cubs, a sport that it's the highest level there is, and maybe you're relatively new to baseball and you have some out of the box ideas. A lot of the ecological dynamic ideas can be a little bit outside the box, which I love in the ways you're constraining players and their movements. Do you meet some resistance as you go?
Yeah, I have in the past, not specifically with the Cubs or anybody like that, but kind of in other sports, and sometimes the kind of this kind of movement, this kind of resistance to moving away from the fundamentals approach. Like for example, when I would talk to hockey coaches always want to focus on developing skating ability from playing hockey. Basketball teams want to focus on shooting form and technique separately out of the game. Those kind of ideas are hard to to get people to move away from at times.
And how do you go about helping them move away from those areas?
I usually the my approach has been to kind of especially I use meet them where they are. So I kind of what drills are you using? They get them to show me, and I watch them. Like I'm like, how can we make it a little bit more the word we use is representative. How can I make it? How can we make it a little more variable? So when you're teaching a player to shoot, can we get them to shoot from slightly different locations, distances? Can you vary the pass you're giving them? Um, can we make it a little bit more game-like? Get someone in their face, trying to block it at times. Even if it's just one person. So on the court, just playing one-on-one. So trying to get the drills they're doing already to be a bit more in the direction we want, consistent with the ecological approach, rather than saying, "Okay, what you're doing is garbage. You got to get rid of all of that." That doesn't work very well. Yeah, so try to get them to move in slowly a bit, a small amount in the direction. Yeah.
I like that. The meet them where they are is a phrase I've used continuously, and I got it from John and Billy, and it sounds like they probably got that one from you. So I
I think a lot of
appreciate
people
that.
say that. So yeah, I won't take credit for it either. Yeah.
Now, with a lot of the sports, it'll be a pretty big staff. Our staff at Florida State is three. Cub staff is dozens. Hockey, same thing. You're going to have a handful of coaches. Do you think that the whole coaching staff needs to be sort of on the same page, or can you have, say, one coach with a more old school rep it out, rep it out, rep it out, or does it need to be everyone's kind of on the same page with the same general philosophy?
Yeah, that's a good question. Some people will strongly debate me. I think you need a consistent coaching philosophy and theory, or a lot of the things are going to be counterproductive to each other, right? If you have one coach saying, I want you to explore different ways to move and self-organize, and you have another coach saying, do it like this. I don't know how those can work together. They're trying to achieve that exact. You have one coach giving lots of technical coaching instructions, saying a lot, and another coach coaching by designing good practice activities. I think those two things are going to fight each other a lot. So yeah, that's kind of the way. I don't think you can switch back and forth personally.
Right. And I know in a lot of the research that I've read and a lot of the books, the Erickson 10,000 hours theory is one that comes up frequently. And I'm of the mind that not all hours are created the same. So 10,000 is kind of, to me, a somewhat arbitrary number. And I know that John Mayer, he kind of looks at it. He's a little bit tentative to use that. What's your thought on the 10,000 hours to mastery theory that's been
Yes.
pretty in vogue for probably 50 years now?
Yeah. Here's the way I see it. So Anders Ericsson did a lot of amazing work studying this concept he developed called deliberate practice, right? And from his work, Malcolm Gladwell, a popular science writer, right? Great writer. I love his work, but he kind of took the message and created this simple story, 10,000 hours to greatness, which, you can get roughly from Anders' work, but it's way too simple, right? No one actually believes that. There's no magic number that hits. So I kind of just think that's kind of a popular story to sell books, really. The key message from Anders Ericsson's work to me is that good elite athletes have more hours of deliberate practice, where deliberate practice is practice focused on improving your weaknesses with a clear intent on making you better, right? What we know about the way athletes practice, especially if you just leave them alone to choose what to do, most athletes want to practice things that they're already good at most of the time because it's way more fun and rewarding, right? If you're a basketball player shooting in the paint when you're good at that, that's way more rewarding than shooting threes if you're not a good 3-point shooter, right? Um, so, but I think that the enduring message from his work is that practice needs to be specific to your weaknesses and kind of with a clear intent. I would say that's deliberate practice. But there's
I
not a
like
certain number of hours of it. You just need this a fair amount of it, quite a bit of it.
right. I
Yeah.
like that. Where would you put competition? So, or for example, our Florida State players and all the college beach volleyball players, they are off for the summer. We can't work with them until we get back into our 8 hour time slots in September. And we just told them to play as much as you can. And where would
Mhm.
you put competing and live competition within? Because to me, I think that's one of the best ways to learn. I mean, that's kind of eco D at its finest, where you're put in a situation. And in beach volleyball, it's such a random sport. You're going to get wind and rain and sun, and you're going to play a bunch of different styles of players. And in baseball, you're going to see pitchers with all different types of
Mhm.
pitches. Their arms are going to come from different angles and locations. Where would you throw competition in there in terms of that deliberate practice model?
Competition. So if by competition you mean like the actual game
Yeah.
itself, um, the I have an expression that I like to use. The game's not the best teacher, right? Because the problem is you're not, imagine your weakness is going back on the ball when it's hit over your head, right? You're not going to get that many opportunities to do that in a game, enough reps of that. You're going to get it randomly mixed with other things. So as far as improving your specific weaknesses and making it better, obviously the game is a great test and pulls those things out. But I think in practice, we could, constraining practice, creating a smaller slice of the game where we just focus on that is actually better than competition, just playing the game in many ways, because I think it can really help focus and improve that thing you need to work on.
Got it. And so in that
Yeah.
situation, I love that example of an outfielder, say, struggling to get those fly balls over its
Mhm.
shoulder. And in beach volleyball, I think one of the most difficult pass serves for players to pass is kind of a high deep serve where they have to open up and get back. And very similar to fielding a fly ball over the shoulder, you have to pass that ball that goes over your shoulder. How would you design a practice to in which that would come up far more frequent than just an actual baseball game where it might happen once, if at all?
Yeah. So I would set up a, practice condition where we could have much more reps of that. So either a machine or someone, a coach hitting to balls over your head, right? And I kind of vary, different constraints like your starting position. Identify why do you have trouble? Are you not getting a good enough jump on the ball, right? Is your first step and kind of work on specific kind of constraints to focus on that. Are you having trouble getting your glove in the right position? You're getting to the ball, but you're not kind of converting it into a catch. So I try to identify what the specific issue is, and then give lots of reps of that specific thing. You know, mixed in with other. So I would probably mix it in with balls that are going to go in front of you and behind. So you still have to kind of decide. You can't just automatically start running backwards as soon as the coach hits it, right? Because that's not realistic. You have to decide still, but that kind of thing. Yeah.
And that you kind of answered the sort of follow up that I was working through on that because we have a lot of sort of blocked versus random. And I think that for me, as I started to dive into this, it's like, all right, we're never doing blocked practices. But then as I thought about it, you can still have an effective blocked practice. Say if we wanted to work on serve receive, but if I wanted to work on those balls over my shoulder, I could say, let's pass 20 balls. And they wouldn't know it, but I would instruct the girls serving, let's make sure that at least 10 are kind of a high deep and the rest of them can be sort of random. So it's blocked in terms of it being a passing drill, but it's
Hmm.
still random. And so they still have to make that movement without knowing that it's coming. Is that kind of how you would view
Yeah,
a
yeah. I
block
think
practice?
by the technical definitions of those terms, I think block practice has got a bad rep. Block practice is when you work on the same skill, right? Serving, you know, catching balls over your head, and for several times in a row. That's not the real enemy. The real enemy is constant practice. So when you work on the same skill with the exact same conditions, so you're doing really strict repetitions, you're repeating the exact same act. You're you know you're returning a serve from the same depth, same speed, same angle over and over and over again, right? That's kind of what we don't want. That show, there's lots of research showing that doesn't lead to long-term as effective learning as having to adjust to different angle speeds and so on. But working on serving with, without having to be returning serves for several trials in a row, which is really what block practice means. So I don't think there's any problem with that. I agree with you.
Yeah, I like that. And it's funny because as I first started getting into it, I was like, block practice is the enemy. But the more I thought about it, I was like, you can still you
Yeah.
can still do blocked and it'd be random.
There's a few kind of the way it's kind of used inconsistently, that term. That's part of the reason I think there's this misunderstanding what people
Yeah.
exactly mean by block practice. Yeah.
And I think that just in my experiences, I'm a very curious person. So as I got into this new field of coaching, I just started reading everything I could, all the podcasts. I listened to your Perception and Action podcast quite frequently. Billy and John's Coach Your Brains Out. And one of the biggest pushbacks I get against this new sort of, I don't know, new generation of coaches in terms of the ecological is that the old school kind of top down, rep it out, rep it out, rep it out. Let's teach them the proper solution first. Is that it's been working, kind of quote unquote working for the last several decades, hundreds of years of sport and coaching, and that this is the way it's been done, and it worked for me. How would you kind of counter that argument, I guess, or debate?
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on there. I think, I think it's worked. Field players have got better despite that method, not because of it.
Right.
But I think it's not to say, like, we're talking about differences in efficiency and effectiveness of
Hmm.
practice, not does it work or doesn't. Like that will almost anything will work, right? Nothing will work. The placebo effect, right? We're a learning machine. We're meant to learn, so we'll get better. I think it's a more effective use of practice time. Um, I think there's a bit of survivorship bias. Like, so for every one great player that got great by doing that kind of thing, I'm sure we could name 5,000 who did the exact same thing and never went anywhere, right? So
Right.
I think survivor. So we're cherry picking the people that were successful using that approach when there's lots of people that do the same thing and aren't successful at all.
Right. And that's kind of what I would have been thinking. And what I'm really wondering about it is say you take a player of the two players of the same abilities. They're twins in their sporting capabilities at that moment. One of them goes with a kind of a top-down coach. One of them goes with a more ecological style. How long do you think it takes the one's practice to be more effective to sort of show up in their performance? And obviously, there's no right answer, but it's not going to be the next day, I wouldn't think.
No, it takes a little time, I think, depending on the age and kind of specificity of what you're working on. Um, we used to believe the dominant idea used to be that using this approach meant slower acquisition of the skill, but it came with the advantage that in the long run, they're going to be much more better problem solvers, creative, adaptable athletes. I think the idea is changing a little bit. I think the idea that it leads to slower skill acquisition is not really well supported. I think you can do it almost just as fast. I think as long as you're kind of manipulating the constraints and things in the right way, kind of progressing them, challenging people at a level that's appropriate for them, then I think they're both almost equivalent in terms of how quick people get it. But it is a little bit like that's I think why the dominant method is still around. I coach kids sports, and when they struggle at all, it's so easy to just jump in there and tell them what to do. Right?
Right.
It's just easy. It's what all the parents want you to do, right? It's hard to resist that. Whereas letting them to explore and just trying to change the game a little bit so that, if you're playing a small sided 3-on-3 soccer, let's change the game, the constraints a little bit and to kind of help them find effective solutions instead of saying kick with this side of your foot and do this. Yeah, it's challenge.
It is. I do think that is the hardest thing to resist is
Mhm.
jumping in and trying to correct it. I mean, how long, especially with kids soccer, how long do you wait until you kind of tweak something or maybe throw in another cue? Because I'm of the, for me growing up, when I sort of figured it out on my own, it was way more effective, and I don't think I'm alone in that. But as a coach, I just want to stop and say, this is what to do. And I'm still trying to figure out how long to wait versus how long to sort of keep kind of manipulating the constraints so they figure it out themselves. Have you found a balance for that?
Yeah, that one it is really challenging. I think there's a couple things. One, we know, that people before they kind of find an effective solution often are very variable. They're trying a whole bunch of things very well. So I think look, you kind of as long as your athletes are kind of exploring, say you set up a small side game so that they pass the ball more readily and they make longer passes. As long as they're trying that, they're kind of moving in the right direction. To me, that's just let that go. At the same time, I think it's okay. Like, I think it's all in how you present things. A lot of this is how you phrase them. Like going to an athlete and saying, "Why don't you try bending your knees a bit more?" I know that's an internal cue. You're kind of telling them what to do, but when you say, "Why don't you try?" I think they're you're setting up you're allowing them to still find their own way to do it, but you're kind of like, here, I'm going to put you in this area to get you started. That's kind of the idea,
Yeah.
without
And
over prescribing it.
and then the another challenge is, I think that athletes, especially the most competitive ones, they want that solution and they want it now. And so if you give them a cue and it doesn't work on that first rep, and I can just speak from when my dad would give me a cue with golf and I'd try it and I'd duck hook it 30 yards right and I'd be like, yeah, nice one, dad. And even though he might not have been right, I might have done something completely different with my swing that caused that. I would just abandon whatever he had just
Yeah,
tried. And so I think that that's a challenge of getting them to stick with it for a little bit until it might click.
yeah. Yeah, I have an interesting study that paper I just published last year where I actually said one way to counteract that is by telling people to deliberately do it wrong, right? I want you to deliberately hit it way to the left, deliberately hit it way. And I found that that's actually an effective way, especially newer people. Because if once you understand how to hit it left and right, then you kind of know don't do those two things and it will go straight, right? That's a simple way to put it, but that's kind of the idea of it. It's not kind of conscious like that, but that's the idea.
Man, one thing I thought was fascinating was I believe it was a golf study where they took a look at golfers and they had one coach, and I think that this was in your book, either How We Learn to Move or Learning to Optimize Movement. They had one of a coach where he would say all the internal stuff of how to do it right. And then they had a coach telling them how to do everything wrong. And it was the coach who told them how to do everything wrong. That
Yep.
group improved more than the coach who told them how to do it right.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that's kind of it. Sometimes we have this approach we call beating the error. So basically you say, oh, that's totally wrong. Do more of it. Because it makes you kind of more aware of it and either to correct it. But yeah, so the specific guy that I did a baseball study where I said, instead of getting a hard hit into fair play, I want you to deliberately hit it foul to the left, foul to the right, pop it straight up, hit it into the ground. I ask people to do everything you don't want to do in a real baseball game. But the other example I like to use in basketball, I want you to shoot the ball so it hits the back of the rim and comes back to you. That takes as much skill as it takes to put the ball in the hoop, right?
Yeah,
It
that's a
takes a
small
lot of skill to
target.
do that. And no, everyone think because you're producing an outcome you don't want. But it kind of takes the pressure away from people a little bit too. They worry of things not going in, strangely. So, but yeah, there are some weird ways getting you to explore. We call that getting you to explore the solution space. Lots of different movements, information, how you link them together is very, very beneficial. There's lots of research showing that.
And it's fun because I coach some juniors here in Tallahassee as well, and so I'll sort of use them as kind of my coaching lab. Like, let's try this one and see if I can bring that to the Florida State girls. And I had one of them because basically, if you keep your hands together while you're passing and you're swinging your arms left and right, that's a pretty ineffective way to do it. We had a couple girls struggling with passing because they were doing that, and I was like, all right, for these next 10 reps, you have to keep your hands locked together, can't move them, and it opened their eyes to how ineffective it was. And it's not like it broke the habit permanently, but they remembered that and they were all laughing. Like, wait, you want us to do it the wrong way? I was like, yeah, just to show you how wrong it kind of is. And then that helped. And I was like, wow, light bulb moment. And it was kind of fun. They were laughing and it allowed them to make mistakes because they were sort of being encouraged to make mistakes. It was fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the other thing we haven't really seen. It's kind of a fun way to coach. It's very creative. Gotta be very creative. Um, the other thing I think why the dominant approach still sticks is it's so easy to you can plan practice 6 months ahead of time, right? We're gonna work on passing this many reps, this many. The ecological approach, you can't do that at all, or you have to be more reactive to what's going on in front of you. So you can't schedule out things months in advance.
Right.
So I think that's kind of one of the things people struggle with as well. Yeah, but I think it's definitely a more fun, engaging way to coach. I just see when you change from the traditional drill to something that fits better, the sound in the room just changes dramatically. You hear people yelling, especially when it's kids yelling, exciting. It's way more fun for them too.
Yeah, yeah, I've enjoyed it. It's been fun exploring this new space. So again, I appreciate all of your work because it's opened my eyes to a lot of different ways that we can work on certain skills, and then it's fun to see some of the girls really enjoy it. Some of them still push back a little bit, as expected from high level athletes when you do something that might be a little bit quirky, like, hey, we're going to pass from the 3 meter line today, and there are going to be a lot of balls over your shoulders, and you're going to have to try to figure it out. So it's been enjoyable. You've really indirectly, we hadn't met until prior today, but you have sort of formed the basis of my coaching philosophy. It's been a blast to explore.
Cool. Yeah. I'm glad to hear that. That's really, why I kind of wrote these books, kind of getting people an introduction and entry point into these things. And it's nice to hear people having some success with it.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it. Now, what are you working on right now? I know you're with the Cubs and at Arizona State, but I feel like you're fairly prolific in your
Yeah.
papers and books.
Yeah. So I kind of, I'm doing the baseball thing, consulting with a few other sports as well. Um, I do have a fourth book in the series. Kind of, I'm slowly developing. I'm not going to put a date on it because I have no idea when at the rate I'm going, when it will actually be done. Um, the yeah, so a few things like that. Kind of keeping my podcast going. So chipping away at things, the same kind of stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, whenever you come out with something new, you have at least three readers. I can speak for John Mayer and Billy Allen that we will be first in line for your books. Where can people follow along with anything that you're putting out into the coaching world?
Yeah, so the website perceptionaction.com, all one word together, is where you find all my stuff, my books, a link to the podcast, and kind of the information if you're interested in working with me at all, are all up there.
Awesome, Rob. Well, I appreciate you taking the time out of a very, very busy schedule. Sorry about the laggy internet delays.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah, glad
Yeah.
we could still make it work. But good luck to the Cubs. Good luck to Arizona State, and good luck on that fourth book. I know that books are a beast to work on. So Appreciate you taking the time to put those out there.
My pleasure. Thanks, Travis.
All right, Rob. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Bye bye.